This one, multiple time return guest, because he always has stuff to talk about, is obviously going to be LS from over there in Korea. So LS, as has actually been a trend, I'm one of the few people who seems to capitalize on this, mate, is like most people, and I do it myself, waste so many good ideas on tweets. And the reason why I say waste is because, you know, in theory you could tweet an idea and then also do content on it. But I know what the creative process is like, and unfortunately when you make a tweet, it does sort of feel in your brain like, I've got that idea out there, it's no problem, I don't need to do any videos about this. So unfortunately people just get, you know, one or two tweets that might be really interesting and they're like, oh, can I hear more? And it's like, no, that's it, see ya. And I do it myself, you know, it's my own problem. So as I have done on some of my past episodes, talk shows, when there's a really good topic, I like it if we can go into a bit of depth on it, you know, and see where people go on it. So what happened was, since we have MSI going on as it speak, and every time in League of Legends, obviously there's not that many international competition, you get to see the international regions match up, right? The classic meme is obviously, you know, has the gap closed between Korea and the Western teams? That's like the classic way to frame it. But actually you framed it a different way, which is rather than say something like, haha, you know, North America or Europe or the West is so far behind Korea, which is the typical way to frame it. You actually made the point that from all the esports games you've followed, Westerners in general, there's some sort of a disconnect that means that, for example, in the case of NA, they're almost never the best at any of the games. Unless, and you probably saw from the replies to that tweet, the only games that anyone was able to name that they were the best in were the ones almost exclusively played by Americans. So, like, I don't know why people would even give those as examples, you know. That's like saying, well, America's the best at baseball. It's like, well, no shit, mate. Like, I'd be pretty worried if they weren't, you know. So anyway, the point was, you sort of opened the can of worms, but obviously didn't have the chance to dive in. And the concept was, you were trying to spitball ideas as to why Westerners, or North Americans specifically, are behind in a number of games, including games where they definitely do put in the time and the resources and all the rest of it. Because actually, I mean, maybe this is the thing we should touch on first of all. I think a lot of this discussion was shaped by the first Starcraft 2 players that were Westerners, and actually in League of Legends, quite specifically by Monte Cristo, obviously a good friend of ours, someone I've had a lot of shows with, because what happened was, in terms of the Western Starcraft 2 players, right, most of them didn't want to live in Korea, and they knew the practice was superior in Korea, and they knew about team houses, which they didn't have. You know, most of them lived in their own home, and they just went to the event. And so they would always say, oh, that's part of what it is. It's just infrastructure. You know, if I was on the Korean ladder all the time, or I lived over there and had practice partners, you know, then I'd be at this level. And then Monty took kind of the same logic, except his angle was usually the idea, which he's not wrong on, it's just a different way of looking at it, was that, you know, obviously they've had coaching structure the whole time from StarCraft 1, and they've had a head coach, and they've had someone who keeps you on track with your practice hours and then can arrange for a practice partner, whereas in different esports games, I mean, it wasn't until about 2 or 3 seasons into League of Legends that every team had a coach, for example. And even then, most coaches were just analysts and they weren't a proper head coach, you know, and we have seen that development. But the reason why I'm setting this all up with quite a long first question is, I don't think actually that it really works, especially when you expand beyond some of these games, to say it was only infrastructure. Like, it wasn't lack of a team house or a lack of a head coach that stopped TSM from winning Worlds, for example. You know, it's not that every other aspect was there and they just lacked the infrastructure. I think we've gotten to the point now where you'd be hard-pressed to say the infrastructure is even really much of a gap. So you were hinting that it's cultural, right? That's where you come down on it?
Right. I think that the problem is more so ingrained in culture because of the way that North America in general tends to operate. I mean, I've made comments in the past that North Americans tend to be willing or wanting to be ruined by praise than saved by criticism. They don't want to be critiqued. Okay. They have this mentality that success or victory is directly associated with improvement, or that as long as things seem to be going well on the surface, then that's all that matters, and the finer details of the finesse of a game isn't as important as the big picture or the big end result. And like you were touching on, it's likely not infrastructure anymore. In StarCraft 2, even in StarCraft 1, I remember Testy not wanting to come over to Korea. Even some of the foreigner players that were considered really, really high level, Testy, Rhett, Draco, Idra, Noni, they came here and they were here for long periods of time. And there's obviously stories that Draco was almost ready to play in the Korean leagues. And this is when Korean esports was at a height for StarCraft 1. Yeah, this was, the Koreans were no joke at that point. And there was obviously rumors that Draco was going to be ready to play on stage. And that was after he was really immersed inside of the gaming house and the culture, and he was on the team, and he was getting the same treatment that all the Koreans get. And it still seemingly wasn't enough. And Draco would, I think, debut in some online Western tournaments. I remember a match, I think, on Rush Hour against Mondragon. He lost and he blamed it on ping or something. But then I'm just sitting there thinking back that, like, Reach or Nalra or any of the really big high-level players wouldn't lose to Mondragon, regardless of ping, on Rush Hour. But then there's so many other Westerners, right? Idra, you hear the stories about Rhett. I think Rhett even made like a blog post saying that he was going like 30 or 40% against B-team Koreans.
Yes.
And the Western world is really blind to just how big the skill gap actually is, because when international events do occur, in almost any game, there's an extremely limited sample size. And when you have best of ones or best of threes, it can help, I guess, hide just how big the gap is, because there's only going to be a limited number of instances where the skill gap can actually show itself. Or the Korean players or whatever are going to be able to showcase just what more they can do or what more they're capable of. And then this leads to the yearly occurrence of is the gap closing, or have Western players caught up, and yada, yada, yada. There is no region in the world, I think, right now, at least in League of Legends, that has so much support and, in theory, money going into it, unless maybe you could argue China. Yes. But even in China, you hear stories about what's going on with pro house practice and whatnot, and how the players can take practice sometimes. And you really have to wonder, is China actually even better off than North America in that regard?
I think on that note, actually, you're probably right. I mean, here's the thing. Yes, China still has so much money that maybe until like franchising has fully got to its peak, maybe we won't surpass like every salary. But I think you're probably right. People don't realize the big complaint people have heard out of China the last few years since the Korean exodus is that actually the flaw of China is they've let the superstar players kind of run amok, especially the Korean imports. And so as a result, you might be right. Actually, the coaching might be, in terms of properly making people practice and players, it might actually be advanced more in North America. And plus, I think on this one, the angle that you also have to point out as to why the infrastructure angle doesn't really make sense is if infrastructure alone got it done, then NA should be way ahead of EU, because EU obviously is still behind on infrastructure. And yet, actually, obviously, historically, EU has been better. And, you know, worst case scenario, they're usually even. So it doesn't really add up, does it?
In every game that I can remember, StarCraft 1, Europeans, pound for pound, were better. Obviously, North America had Idra, Yosh, and Noni at the very end, but Europe had Mondragon, they had Draco, they had Fisheye.
In most games, from my experience, it tends to be the case that, like, so for example, if we're just comparing Europe and NA, what happens is NA will have some really good players, and they might be just as good as the best Europeans. The difference is, if NA had, like, say, 5 really good players in a game like StarCraft, Europe would have, like, 15 or 20.
Right. That has been what I've obviously tended to notice as well. And then also, I think that the Europeans' take on the game, I've talked about this a lot in videos in the past, is Europeans tend to be more in line with the fundamentals of the game, whatever the core fundamentals are, whether it's StarCraft or if it's going to be Warcraft or if it's going to be League of Legends or something. Whereas NA is more centered around the strategical aspect of the game. This was present in StarCraft 1, StarCraft 2. I think it was even present in Warcraft 3, although I didn't heavily follow the scene there. And then obviously you can also see it in League of Legends as well, where their core fundamentals of the game are lacking in a macro sense or even in a micro sense, but they'll try to be more innovative than other regions. And you can even see this when games are fresh, like when StarCraft 2 first came out, or when a really big major patch comes out. You'll see innovation come out from NA. They'll be quick to experiment, and they'll look for all these cheesy, quick means to an end sort of obstacles in a route. And I think when you have that going on constantly, and you have these people all striving to be the first to achieve something, or me, it becomes toxic in a way that if the circle continuously keeps going on, it ends up hurting the core aspect of the region.
I can actually give you a good counterexample for that. Like a similar example from another game, which is that in both Counter-Strike and League of Legends, I noticed this is something that was heavily a part of approach of even the top players and teams. So, for example, in Counter-Strike, famously, one of the reasons why, I mean, we only had Europe and North America basically for most of Counter-Strike, and Europeans basically were generally the superior players. And what would happen was, first of all, North Americans almost never had a true practice culture. They would play scrims, but when you played the scrim even, there was ego involved. You were trying to win the scrim, which is something we definitely heard about in the early days of League of Legends. Likewise, like famously, supposedly, some of the teams like CLG that had double lift, they were just trying to win the scrim and they weren't actually like practicing anything. And so they would think, oh, I did 70% win rate. It's like, that doesn't really matter. And then the other part is, in Counter-Strike especially, one of the weird things is, even though they wouldn't scrim properly, they would put in way more hours trying to find like a really crazy boost that you could do on a map, you know, where you're in a spot that no one expects you to be. And that's like, it's basically like cheese in Counter-Strike, you know, you can get an extra kill out of it that you wouldn't normally. And they would have all these crazy boosts and like weird things. But as you're saying, like the one thing they're shying away from is they won't practice the fundamentals. They just think, well, I'm a really good player. So if I do something wacky, then I could win. But that's obviously kind of a short-term mentality, you know. And likewise, I think in League of Legends, I mean, I remember famously that first TSM squad that was really good. They were really good, like, players, but they had, like, one of the reasons they were so triggered by that famous scenario where they played a Zubu Frost and a Zubu Frost cheated and looked at the screen is because they'd put, like, so much of their Worlds training into, like, weird level 1 invades and stuff. And it's like, listen, I get it. That's cool if you can do it, but that's not going to win you Worlds. Like, that might win you one game, you know. So I have seen this. This is something I have actually seen as a trend across multiple games.
Yeah, and I don't know why there's people that preach that there's other problems for NA, such as like the solo queue. The solo queue obviously isn't helping them, given that there's so many different people on so many different pings, and obviously this can be a problem. But that's
also a bit more league oriented, you know. It doesn't really apply to the other games, you know. Yeah,
that doesn't entirely apply to other games at all. But in League of Legends, I mean, if you look at the North American solo queue, or if we take a look at the regions and what they're known for in regards to how do the players behave, you can go on to Challenger NA solo queue or something, and a weird play will happen where someone misses a skill shot or someone gets massively outplayed, and then there will be multiple players that type in all chat LOL. And that's their initial reaction to the highest level competition solo queue ladder. And I think that's pretty stupid. Obviously, EU West is known for toxicity. Korea, known for toxicity and a pretty rigorous practice and training environment. Although at the very high end, you're only playing with pros and stuff, so it's going to be less so. But sure. When your region is infested with people that are getting by playing super simple, mechanically basic champions, and they're able to retain a high MMR, and everything's so carefree. And you have the other problem that some people have been vocal about with the streaming and the ghosting stuff, where and I'm not going to say that it holds anyone back from like climbing ladder or anything, but when you do have so many people casually acknowledging that streaming and ghosting and stuff is a thing, and there's so many people inside of the region that are going to abuse that and make use of it because of a me mentality. They want to win through any means necessary. It ends up impacting the overall experience of that region. But again, this all ties into culture in a way. Why is it that at the highest MMR, people think that things are funny, or they joke around rather than practicing? Or why is it that it's okay to play such poor champions? Or why is it okay to, not necessarily okay, but why? Yeah, well, why is it okay to stream to thousands of people and you don't have any anti-ghosting methods? And even when people are asking you to do anti-ghosting methods, you don't do it. And I'm not going to say that Europeans maybe don't do anti-ghosting methods. Sure. They might. But the response that it's not my problem or they just shouldn't ghost or blah, 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 it's this anti-competitive mindset that I think is really problematic. And then when we go into the competitive thing, sort of like what you were saying earlier about people going into scrims and they just want to win, that's still true to this day. You can have a player inside of a scrim, and if they're performing poorly but their team is winning, they'll still feel bad, as if they're being left out, rather than feeling satisfied that their team is winning, or that the team is doing things correctly, or the team was going into the scrim with an intent to focus on something or practice something specifically, and they were able to execute that, but maybe that individual player performed poorly, so maybe he even ends up sabotaging the scrim in some way, with poor behavior or just remaining silent or maybe not performing to the best of his ability. And it's just so sad to see it continuously keep happening, even up until this day. And to constantly see people on Twitter or Reddit or something pretend that this type of behavior or these types of thought processes are magically going to be fixed, or that there's anything anyone can do to fix it. I just think it's totally nonsense. Because
I'll give you an example, actually.
15 years. Yeah.
Here's a good example. Again, this is like sort of corroborating evidence that all patterns I've seen in other games. So, like, first of all, to start in League of Legends was something you were saying here about streaming culture and the fact that, yes, generally, like the best way I'd describe it is this. Except for people like maybe Bjergsen and Doublelift, if they really want to, like, they're trying to grind when they play solo queue. The general sense is, even if you're a pro player, solo queue is where you play for fun. Now, in EU West, well, that's the whole joke, isn't it? The reason it's toxic is, no one's having fun because everyone's an arsehole. But what no one ever mentions is that has an upside, which is, even though it's like, it is like it's like the movie Whiplash, isn't it? It's like the harsh way to train someone, but it keeps you on your P's and Q's. It makes you play properly. It makes you play the correct way. You don't just do stuff like, haha, look, watch this. I'm going to just flash over this bush and try a stupid, oh, that didn't work. Who cares anyway? Like, you don't do that generally, Like, I'm sure it has negatives. Like, for example, compared to Korea, maybe more people just run it down mid if they lose the game. There might be times where the toxicity has a negative effect, but you can see how, in contrast to a world in which even pros are like, this is just fun, it's going to be better for competition. Because I would tie that into, like you're saying, people have a lot of like non-solutions. Like, people's non-solutions are stuff like, oh, well, maybe in the future, something will happen that there'll be more pro players and therefore people will be more serious in solo queue. And it's like, are you listening to yourself? Because the problem here is, right, you already have, how many, is there 10 teams in LCS? Is it 10 or 12? I think it's 10.
10, right? Yeah.
So if there's 10 teams, right, nowadays they have subs, but let's imagine they only have 5 players. That means in NA, for as long as there's been 10 teams, there has been 50 full-time professional players who, if they were all in Challenger, well, that's Challenger right there. If they all just played normally and didn't dick around, you would already have a culture that inspired people who were just below pros to try properly. So actually, that was a self-fulfilling prophecy that, it's just for fun. Yeah, well, that's because even the pro goes in there and goes, no one else is going to try, so I'm not. Because I can tell you, this is the corroborating story. The same thing happened in Counter-Strike. What happened was, in the early days of CSGO, so CSGO came out in 2012, for about the first year and a half, there weren't proper organizations with big sponsors for the NA teams. So a lot of them didn't make a salary, or they made a very small salary, and they couldn't go to every big LAN tournament because most LAN tournaments were in Europe at the time. You had to fly. And so at the time, they always used to say to the European teams, essentially, it's infrastructure. They would say, if we had a salary like you guys, we'd practice 12 hours a day. And if we were at every LAN tournament, well, guess what? A year or two later, they got salaries that were comparable. They got options of team houses. They went to all the LANs, and they only, to a small degree, improved their results. And then likewise, they had the same scrim culture problem I described before. They would always say, so at this point in time, before the sponsors, they used to say, well, our problem is, right, there's only 2 top teams. There's these 2 top teams, and since we're really good, we only have each other to practice against. If we practice against anyone else, they're bad. They don't take the scrims properly. And so because we can win easily, it's not a proper scrim. And I always used to say, well, first of all, if there's 2 of you, you at least practice each other properly. And they would even admit, nah, not really, we hate those guys. So they weren't even getting the best out of that practice. And then here's the kicker. I think you can probably already tell where the cycle's going to go here. So then in come all the sponsors, and now you've got 6 teams that are proper pros and have been to LANs. even with the 6 teams LS, and to this day, they don't practice properly, to the extent that when a top team came from Brazil and moved to NA and became the best team in the world, everyone in NA was like, how are they doing it? How are they practicing against us? And we don't practice properly, but they're being the best team in the world. And then I actually asked some of the Brazilian players, and they said, oh, what you actually have to do is you can't just play normally because they just play to win. You have to pretend like you're in a LAN game and never do anything that you wouldn't get away with against a better opponent. So that just exposes completely that, like, it's going to be a never-ending cycle of this philosophy that, oh, well, some of us aren't trying properly, so I'm not going to try. You know, it's like that is somehow built into the mindset of these players. Because again, these aren't the same people. You know, some of these are in Counter-Strike, some of them are 10 years ago, some of them are now, some are in League of Legends now, some are in Starcraft 2 5 years ago. It's the same mindset. Because I agree with it. It somehow has to come from culture, because it has to come from what these people were raised to think of as competition, or if you apply yourself, if no one's looking over your shoulder. You know, it's all these like factors that I realize they're tough to figure out if you haven't been to other countries, because you might think, isn't everyone like that? But they aren't. I mean, we've heard, if you want to use the Korean example, we all know the stories of Korea where some of the players who become semi-pros even, like, they're basically risking everything. They might have to leave home, or they get looked down. You know, there's all these factors that, yes, again, they're not nice factors, but they might spur you to become a great player. Whereas if you're just having a cool time at home in NA, maybe there's no fire under your ass, if you know what I mean.
I mean, one of the first things that comes to mind on the topic of players that don't have anything, but they do everything, is like the Rocks Tigers when they were playing out of PC bongs. And they just didn't have anything going for them. I mean, there's been so many other Korean teams. Look at the Korean team Griffin. They've had not the best experience the last year and a half or something. Is this a challenger team? This is the challenger team that that was causing an uproar in Korea recently. They didn't have the best of experience, but they're probably better than most LCS teams. And in fact, I would go as far to say they are better than most LCS teams. And no one has heard of them. And it's like, you can't say that they have it better than some of the North American LCS teams in terms of staff and support and whatever else is going on. No, but they just make better usage of it. I think that there's a problem also. Something I wanted to talk about was the MMR gap. I don't know exactly if this is present in CSGO or something, but I think there's a really, really big problem when other regions, their ladders or whatever, when you refer to NA, you end up having to downgrade whatever an equivalency is. So if there's Korean Grandmaster or Korean Master in StarCraft, you would say that it's High Grandmaster in North America. By the way, as you referenced with Bet earlier, this is the same in StarCraft 2. I mean, Nanoa was a good friend of mine, so I knew him very well. Yeah. He used to literally tell me every time he went back to Korea, so he'd go to the West for a few months, live in Sweden again, go to all the MLGs. He said every time he went back to Korea, the first few weeks, not even first week, the first few weeks would involve losing and to B-teamers, and he'd be thinking, fucking hell, am I ever going to win if I lose to this guy? But if you could get through the first 2 weeks, you would then elevate your level, you'd be good enough to play the top. But what that's showing is a guy that, you know, if he was playing on the EU server, he'd be like Grandmaster with like 80% win rate, wouldn't he? So the same quality it couldn't translate directly. Yeah, you couldn't translate it. And also, I think this is a problem with spectators, is an inability to detect the difference. Like you're talking about Naniwa going over to Korea and losing to B-teamers. I remember Grubby, when he came over to Korea and he was High Grandmaster or something on US at one point, or people will reference Stefano when he came over to Korea, or Scarlet or whatever. And the spectators or the people on Reddit or Twitter, they will see the end result of whatever is going on with these players, but they won't see what's going on in the in-between. They won't see them losing to the B-teamers. They won't see them going negative win rate or failing to find success on the ladder. And what this ends up doing is they are ignorant and incapable of even seeing how big is the difference, or what exactly is it that's causing the difference between these random solo queue players or these random StarCraft ladder players and our top tier cream of the crop professionals. And when you end up having this, you have the thing that occurs where people like on Reddit right now, if a Western pro hits challenger on Korean ladder, you have a bunch of people and they're like, why is this news to people? People do it all the time. It's like, no, people don't do it all the time. You just don't pay attention. There's 2 LCS pros right here that are here right now that had negative win rate and they were climbing in Diamond 2 because Riot IDs. And then obviously, yes, you get people like Reckless, or you get people like Double Lift, or you'll have other people come here. Again, the cream of the crop, professional players ingrained in an LCS competitive environment coming into a solo queue that fosters competitive play and proper meta play. So naturally an environment where they should flourish. And people will be like, oh, well, they get 600, 800 LP on their main, ladder, and they go to Korea and they do the same thing. And it's just not comparable, because people can't actually see what the hell is going on, or how is 600 or 800 MMR achieved. You wouldn't say that, someone let's say someone in CSGO goes to a major and they get first place, and then they go to a local and they get first place. And they would say that the same end result is achieved. They get first place, so they get second place, so it must be the same. And that's what the fuck kind of an argument is that? But the difficulty that occurs in order to achieve the same end result is just mind-blowing. Yeah. So when you have the ladders of the regions be so grossly different, in StarCraft at one point it was absolutely atrocious. It was something like top 12 master on Korea was mid to high GM on North America, and I think it was Wings of Liberty.
The funny thing is, I remember, LS, this ties in again to the idea that Americans look for like the cheap route out, because I remember I always used to have to explain this to my friends who knew a little bit about StarCraft Brood War. I would let them watch like some of the Korean leagues with me, and then and since like Bisu was my favorite player, right, they'd be saying stuff like, he's not as good as like Jaedong and Flash, and I was like, he plays Protoss, right? Like at the top level in Korea, that's the hardest race to play with the worst matchups, with none of the maps designed for you practically. Like he's basically playing hard mode and he's still really fucking good. And they were like, nah, you're full of shit. Whenever I play, I'm wrecking Terrans and Zergs when I'm playing with Protoss. I said, yeah, because when you play at like the B fucking minus or C level, if you just like, if everyone's mechanically bad, you're just doing stupid proxies all over the place. Like he can't do that at the pro level. Like the point I'm making here is that was even prevalent in NA and StarCraft 2. It was definitely a lot of the Westerners you'll notice were fucking Protoss players in Brood War, because you could get away with shit with these.
Oh, there was no Terrans.
With the same, exactly. Yeah,
and likewise, no Western Terrans.
Even though in both Brood War and StarCraft 2, the best race to be if you are the best player is Terran. It's inarguable. Just look at the results and the number of great players. And yet you look at the West, and there almost never were any Terrans. There was like 1 or 2 ever that were good, and they were never the best. So it's the same principle playing out again. People just went for people didn't realize that the fact that they could get away with some cheesy shit or some very low level shit showed that their scene wasn't as competitive. It wasn't driven to competition,
Yeah, no, and I think this is the exact same thing, even in League of Legends, but in a weirder sense, where you can get away with certain team compositions sometimes. You can get away with certain spots occurring inside of games, and you can get away wins, and it'll lead the public to being blinded by how big is the gap really, or what exactly is it that's causing the gap. And then when you also have this mentality on this topic of like skill gap and people that are saying like the Bisu thing that you're mentioning, right? People would watch Bisu, they wouldn't realize how much APM and mechanics and difficulty goes into making Protoss able to contend at that level of play. And then likewise, when you watch, one of the things that comes to mind lately is since Korean streamers in the last few months have really been beginning to stream. I mean, obviously they've been streaming for longer than just a few months, but there's a lot more Korean streamers now on Twitch than in the past. They used to be on Afrika, they used to not stream at all. Yes. One of the big things that comes up nowadays is APM between your average Korean League of Legends pro and your average Western pro. And you'll see people on Reddit or even YouTube comments, if you go to Faker highlights or you go to Marin highlights or whatever, you watch these top tier players, you'll have these people be like, why are they clicking so much? That's stupid. I watch Bjergsen or I watch, so-and-so stream and, another Western pro name, and they don't click this much, so it must be okay. and it's just an ignorance to what exactly it goes into refining those core fundamentals. And because I feel like at this point, because I've seen it in StarCraft 1, StarCraft 2, League of Legends now, I assume it's probably the same fucking case in Overwatch or Warcraft or CSGO or whatever. When people are intimidated by superior fundamentals or someone going out of their way to get super small micro edges, they'll choose to just say, oh, well, it doesn't matter that much, or it's not that important. And then they'll completely put it off and deflect it because they don't want to be bothered to learn it. And I know that this was a case in Super Smash Bros. Melee, where all the new age players at one point, it was a couple of years ago, I wish I did a little bit more research before we made this video together. There were some of the top tier pros refusing to learn some of the new techniques, whether it was like shield drops or something like that, or maybe it was a new type of cancel. And it was because mechanically the inputs were difficult. And learning how to incorporate these mechanical difficult inputs into your already top tier play that you're able to just constantly show up to a tournament, get top 8, top 16, they didn't really see a reason to. But then obviously over time, the skill level and the level of play reaches a point where you do need to take time now to learn this if you want to retain being at the highest level. But the outright refusal to pick it up in the face of objective evidence that it is better, it is superior, it lets you do certain things that you're just not doing, you're not able to tap into, it's just fucking mind-blowing. Because it is the top tier players looking at it and going, yeah, that's definitely better, but I'm lazy, I guess. And you find this in League of Legends too. You'll see it in League. I know that I saw it in StarCraft. I wish I knew more about Overwatch to know what's going on there, because Owl's going on, right? And I don't know how the training is or what's going on there, but I'm really curious, actually. You would probably know a lot more than me because I don't follow it that much. What is going on inside of Owl? Because all the Koreans and Asian players are in North America now, right?
Yes, basically.
They're all practicing. Okay.
For season 1, they all just live in LA, basically, and the way it's set up is very weird, because even though technically there's only one playoffs, which is at the end of season 1, they have 4 stages, and each stage is sort of like a mini LCS. Like, you play a bunch of games, you know, it used to be top 3, but now top 4 teams go to a mini playoffs, and then they have a mini playoffs for each. So it's like having 4 sort of small LCS splits, and then a playoff at the end, and they're all just in one city. So it's kind of like an LCS format in that sense. Okay.
Oh, that's interesting. But then I feel I'm curious on as to what is happening because in League of Legends, when the imports go over to another regions, they tend to get worse.
Yes, I actually did a video on this topic where I said that.
Oh, okay.
I had a video that was basically called like the Korean issue or something, and it was about Overwatch. And one of the things I said was I actually couldn't see a way in which Westerners could get what they thought they wanted, because what they thought they wanted was this LS. They want a bunch of Western players, because obviously they want to cheer for Western players and they like Western players, but they simultaneously want the best Koreans so it can be the best league. And I said, basically, as far as I can tell, there's like 3 sort of ways this can go, and none of them will allow what you want. Because option number 1 is that Koreans come over, they don't have any problems, and because they're amazing, everyone learns, like, this is an arms race, let's all just get as many Koreans as we can, in which case you eliminated all the Westerners. Option 2, Koreans come over, they're not absolutely the best, and in fact, you know, some of them are just good for Owl, but, you know, maybe the contenders players back in Korea surpass them, in which case you also have failed, because now it's not the best league, because there's some players in Korea who are really good. Or option 3 is the Koreans come over, maybe they're not even the best, and they degrade like some of the players in League of Legends did. And I said, all 3 are possible, and none really ever end up with what you want from the league. You know, there's always a key flaw to it. Now, I will say, it seems to be like a mix of all of them at the moment. Because first of all, I also did another video on this topic. There's been a creep of like people recruiting Koreans. Every team in Overwatch League now has at least 1 Korean, and a bunch have like 2, 3. You know, some have half a team, and obviously there's a couple of teams that were full Korean anyway. Then also, you had some players clearly did just fall off a cliff. Like, I don't know that it's necessarily as hardcore as when you have, like, you know, one guy go to NRG and he's just the only Korean. That's obviously very different. You know, some of these are, even some of the teams of Koreans, some of their players massively fell off. And then, yeah, just generally you can see that there have been some issues with it. I wouldn't say it's as hard and fast as the League of Legends example, though, because that was more like, you know, isolation. They were in a different culture, different infrastructure. So some of that got offset, but it definitely... It was. I don't think anyone could have predicted the way it went, put it that way. Because again, most people don't look from the cultural angle.
No, yeah, it's almost like the Koreans coming over, the Asian players, and even on their games, they're like getting whitewashed by the environment and the culture. They're unable to practice the way that they normally would in their home environment. They're unable. I call it the Korean engine, or like the machine. Right, where the entire region or the solo queue, it's like a super bacteria, you know, killing off the weak and just constantly refining and building upon itself over and over and over. And if you can't keep up, or if you get complacent, then you just get tossed by the wayside. You know, you end up being basically useless to the machine. And if there's not enough people that share that mindset, then the engine never gets off its feet. It never gets off the ground. And then you'll have the players deteriorate. And then obviously the instant retort by someone on Reddit or something to that would be like, they could reference Starcraft and be like, oh, what about Pult Prime, right? Because Pult went to North America, he studied in NA, and then he was at the peak of his career. You're a fucking retard. You are an idiot if you don't think Pult would have been better if he stayed in Korea. Because he would have been. Would he have had as much success? No, probably not, because he would have been forced to go up against Koreans all the time. And it would have meant that he probably wouldn't have been able to find so much success. And we saw this in some of the Western stars. I think it was Tasia, right? Yes. Liquid Tasia would dominate the Western scene, and he would beat Koreans or something in the West.
Oh,
and then he
the ridiculous
do
thing was, yeah, he was the best example, because what would happen was, literally a week before or a week after GSL playoffs, where he'd never made a single final, by the way, he could lose to a guy in the playoffs. He could lose to many players in the playoffs, by the way. But if he played that same guy in one of those weekend tournaments, like an MLG and IM, he'd fucking win the whole tournament. Like he'd mop up MVP or someone, you know, like someone amazing.
Yeah, no, it was absolutely insane. I mean, there's so many other examples like Tasia, like Pult, that people will reference as if it is somehow going to deny the fact that the players are getting worse when they're not inside of that normal environment.
The joke me and Monty have for this is that it's like there's an aura around Seoul, and if you're outside of it for too long, like, you know, your power level starts to fade, and that's why you have to like go back to reconnect to the Borg or whatever, you know, and like power up again.
Did you ever see Guardians of the Galaxy 2?
Yes.
It's like fucking Planet Ego. They gotta go back to the planet to get their powers back, and like without it they end up just fading away. But no, I don't know. It's really problematic. So that was really interesting for me to hear about Overwatch and what's going on in there. But in like,
here's an angle for you, because you can talk to this because you've obviously been inside team houses. I even think I don't blame people like Monty and some of the Westerners for thinking it was just infrastructure, because first of all, they're actually using like a confirmation bias, which is that they pick the most exceptional Westerners we've ever had, and then they're like, look, he's fine. It's like, mate, they produce guys like that every year in Korea. Like, look at some of the guys who came up in this new Afrika team. Half of those guys were nobody a year ago. Like, these aren't all players, you know, and that, whereas we don't get like a new double lift every year, we get one like every couple of years, and when we have them, they can always remain the best. So another angle is, this is what my point I'm trying to get to, is that some of the culture stuff almost like masqueraded as infrastructure. So I'll give you a great example. When someone joins a Western team who's a skilled player, it's already sort of understood in our culture, right? Well, he's really skilled, which means he's one of the best players, which means he's going to get like resources. He's going to get to be a starter. He's maybe even going to get say over who's on his team or how he plays. He's going to have a lot of power actually given to him just because he's skilled in the game. Whereas I often tell people this story, right? First of all, if you know about Starcraft like we do, there's an even better example, which is people who work their way up as a practice partner. You know, started as a practice partner, became a B team player. It's like when you were saying about Draco and Idra. There's a reason why they didn't just get put straight into games. They had to sort of like work their way up the dojo inside their own team house, as it were. And until they got good enough, the coach isn't going to waste their time. He doesn't care that you might have talent. If you can't prove you can consistently do it, why would I give you a spot in the Pro League? No, that's a valuable spot. Well, the League of Legends example I always give people is, if you remember when Koreans first started like getting good, which was season 2 when they got their server and you had the Azubu teams, etc. At the time, one of the most outrageous rookies was Shy when he joined Azubu Frost and replaced Loco Doko. And he already, if you remember like the early tournaments he was playing in, he was already fucking amazing. And that was the time when he could play like carry tops. Yet, I remember reading interviews about their team and even meeting the Azubu Frost players. And guess what? Even though he might have been, along with Mad Life, like the best player in the team, he had the lowest status in their team because he was the youngest and he was brand new to the pro scene. And so, and even though his skill was, he was amazing, they kept him sort of under their thumb with the mentality of like, you've got to earn your status in this team. And your status comes from like longevity, knowing how we play, what our team culture is, like showing that you're a team player, you know, working your way through. It's actually something we have in European sports. It's like a famous thing where you sort of, you haze the rookies, you know, like they, even if you're a star football player and you join a team when you're 16, you have to literally, it's no joke, they give you a pro player who's currently like a veteran and you have to clean his boots. That's what they do, because they want to like break your ego so it like forms in a healthy manner. They don't want you to come in like hot shit, like, hey, you know, I could wreck all you old guys, you know. This is an aspect that people miss out on, because as I say, in the West, unfortunately, we just take that logic of like, you're talented and just give them everything from day one. They never have to sort of learn how to be a pro in a way.
Yeah, it's really, really sad, and I'm glad that you brought up Europe, because for me, in the last like 10 years of esports, I felt like that has been actually a really, really big contrast between North Americans. When a North American's really good versus when a European is really good, it is a night and day difference between how they tend to conduct themselves, at least in terms of how are they going to fit into their improvement mindset. Whereas the North American gets complacent, they would more so desire to be ruined by criticism, or ruined by praise than saved by criticism. And then it's just really mind-boggling. Whereas in Korea, like what you just said, I mean, it is present even to this day. You can have an absolutely godlike player, and he'll still look up to the other 4 members of his team, and he'll revere them and treat them better than himself. And when you do think that you're hot shit and that the team should revolve around you, well, you get kicked out like fucking SKT aiming or whatever. Or, you know, there's so many instances where players just get the boot because, yeah, they might be better than their peers or their teammates, but it's not going to fly. It's not going to operate that way. And
that is a culture thing.
Yeah,
I mean, it looks like it's infrastructure because the coach is deciding, but in reality, he's deciding because of what Korean culture is like.
Right, and you just would not have that happen in NA. Just would not happen. So I don't know, and that's also not something that they're just going to magically pick up happen. I feel like some management would hear that, or they would see that, and then it'd be like, okay, we're going to try that one day. They're just going to arbitrarily go out and be like, you know what, you're going to get kicked, and like, not understand why they're doing it. And then it's not really going to have a positive effect. And by the way, with everything that we're saying, it doesn't mean that there aren't good NA players or good European players that aren't on par with Koreans. It's that they're fucking surrounded by this infested cultural problem that doesn't let them ever get out.
Well, it's like, if you ever look, this is one of the reasons why probably the player who to people on Reddit most typifies the concept of EU West toxicity is obviously Forgiven, because even like look at MSI right now. He's tweeting out like every time Fnatic or TL plays and does some shit. He doesn't go like, oh, what a shame they have lost. He'll be like, you know, what is this trash? Why do they think they can get away with this? If I came back with 2 weeks, I'd kill all these guys. Like, the reason why is because the reason he comes off as super toxic is because we don't have 10 players who have that like ridiculous mindset and drive to be like, I will be the best no matter what. So unfortunately, since there's no one else, he just stands apart, and then sadly it is some of it channeled in anger, you know, so it comes off very badly. But if you could get to the core of that, funny enough, it's the same thing with a lot of these players. It's the same thing with Nanoa and Starcraft. It's the same, you know, these people all, it gets channeled in a bad way because they don't have the culture and the infrastructure necessary to turn them in, like, sort of to the light side, as it were. But there's a reason why these guys are so mad. It's because they know that people aren't pushing them to do it, and that when they push themselves to do it, what do you know? Like I'll give you a classic example from Forgiven's career. One of the reasons why Forgiven got a really bad rep when he first came into the LCS, when he played on that Copenhagen Wolves team, which wasn't a good team, and he was pretty much like hard carrying it, is because he would be known as like a toxic player, but good at the game. And then meanwhile, at the time, his top laner was the guy who became the G2 coach, Youngbuck. And what was pissing Forgiven off is that because Youngbuck he's a really cool guy. So because he was really good at like interviews and Twitter and stuff, everyone would be like, Youngbuck's okay. Why is everyone getting so mad at him? And meanwhile, Forgiven knew that he was like, I think at some point in time, Youngbuck was like hard stocking Masters while they were in LCS or something. And so Forgiven would be like just losing his shit. Like, why the fuck is my teammate stocking Masters? So that means he's either not good enough or he doesn't put in the work to get out. You know what? Like, how is this acceptable? I'm putting in all these hours and then we lose. And yeah, guess what? I'm going to be the guy who blows up, aren't I? That guy's going to be like, no big deal. Yeah, because you didn't put in all the hours, did you? It's actually what's mad is we're even labeling some of these players who do have the mentality to create this culture. We're just ostracizing them. We're going, you're too toxic. You got to get the fuck out.
They're too toxic.
And they are in their own way. But you know, it's like there's something there though. There's something good there if you could sort of separate out the bad stuff and just get to the good part. Because that's what we want to encourage is this environment.
Well, I think it goes back to what I said earlier about how if someone's intimidated by something that is going to require too much work or too much effort, like the Korean APM thing that I mentioned earlier, they'll choose to say, oh, that's not necessary. So-and-so can do it, or so-and-so can get away with not doing it. I don't need to do it. It's not necessary. I see them on the world stage. And similarly, if you're surrounded by people that aren't criticizing your work ethic, or they're not criticizing, like Youngbuck in your example, right? If 50 people aren't telling him that it's a problem that he's in Masters, but Forgiven's telling him that it's in Masters, they'll ostracize Forgiven because he's the one drawing attention to the actual problem, and then it's
also obviously easier to just say, well, the thing that's annoying me now is this Forgiven guy keeps complaining, so he's the problem, get rid of him. Whereas, yeah, it's like, if it was everyone saying it, that's like that old joke, isn't it? You know, like, if everywhere you go it smells like shit, check the bottom of your shoes. Like,
yeah.
that's what wasn't happening for these guys, though.
Mm-hmm. And so they'll choose to label the person as toxic, and you know they're the problem, even though it's actually they're just calling out the corruption that is present. And just the lackluster of practice. Also, this just popped into my head. On the topic of infrastructure and whatever else, we could bring up StarCraft 2 really quick, because StarCraft 2 in Korea is a shadow of its former self. There's no team houses, I think, except for Janair. Janair still has a team house.
Okay.
The ladder it still exists, but it's on like its last leg, to my knowledge. And there's a ton of foreigners still here inside of Korea. There's that gaming house that has like Scarlet,
right,
Neeb, and Zanster. I hope I just said his name right. Major. They still can't win. So, and that's been going on for like a year now, I think. Koreans haven't had their team houses for, I think, longer than a year. The foreigners have had their team house located in the heart of Korea with the best foreigners that can come over and stay. They all live together. They still can't touch Koreans. Even though, you know, the Koreans are pretty handicapped right now. They're both they have their crutches and their wheelchairs and stuff. But still.
By the way, because obviously some people will get mad at this. Like, yeah, obviously it has happened at times. Like, for example, Scarlet won that StarCraft 2 tournament and Neeb won one. But the difference is, yes, that's an improvement over the old scenario. But when these guys go to GSL, none of these people are making the final. Like, get real. And also, that is all, like, to tie into what you're saying here, it's like the fall of Rome. Okay, so Rome falls and a bunch of barbarians come in, smash everything up. They now aren't the new Rome. They don't have an awesome fucking massive thing. Like, no, the other thing just got so shit that they eventually just wrecked it. And I'm like, yeah, there we go. We're in. It's like, there's a big difference, you know. One got decrepit and got beaten. That's how.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what's going on. And I don't know how it is in Warcraft 3, but I don't keep up with the scene. But I do think that the Asians that still play are on top. Because I know that there is still some Europeans that still play, right? And then I think that it's still big in China. And I think there's still some Korean players that play. But even to my knowledge there, it's not looking so hot for the West.
The thing is, though, another angle, like maybe you can talk to this, it's like, especially League of Legends specific, is that, in fact, actually, I guess it was in StarCraft as well. You also, part of the culture is, because you have to like earn your status, work your way up. Also, another part, as I keep stressing, is it's not even about just being a good player. You also have to sort of show that you fit the group identity, you know. If you are a bit of a wild guy, you might be as skilled as hell and you might not get your chance. Well, that's why you've had all these instances in Korea, for example, of like ridiculous guys who just stay as a sub forever. My favorite example ever has got to be Peekaboo. Does no one remember, before he came in to play for KT, wasn't he like on SK Telecom or something like that? And they just never played him in any fucking, like played him like 2 times ever. And he couldn't get in the game. Then when he came into KT, he like turned the whole team around. He's fucking amazing. So again, there's something about how the culture sort of lets you move up and what is demanded of you to move up that just does not exist. You get the fast track of the West. I mean, you get some of these people. Think about this guy at MSI now for Team Liquid, Joy. Who the fuck is that? And he's playing in an MSI match for this team. I've never even heard of this guy.
Well, hold on. Let's talk about, Wraith.
Yes, he
retired.
was another one, obviously for Samsung, yeah.
He fucking retired. If he was born on the wrong fucking continent. If he was in North America, if he was born in North America, or, he had NA residency, he wouldn't be retiring. He would be on a 6-figure salary.
Dude,
because that's how much better he is.
He could still play at LCK, but he was willing to just sit as a sub. I can't even believe they can convince people to do that as well. That's like a really good player will go, I hope I can play one day. And you go, like half the teams in the league could use you. Nah, I'll just wait for my chance. I hope fucking Young thinks I've been good enough to spin. It's like, it's unreal, isn't it? That's why actually, for people who think that we're just spinning it all as positives, it's like what I said about the Forgiven example. There are big negatives to this. There's a lot of people who just wiled away in the Korean system and never got their chance and were just almost nobodies, but who had insane talent. So it's like, I always say this, there's aspects of the Korean system I wouldn't want to introduce into America, but you can't deny the results. So the problem is, do you want to win or do you want to have a comfortable life and win? You know? It's like, I always tell people this, I wouldn't recommend anyone becomes a pro player. It's a fucking nightmare. But if you are super skilled and you're driven to do it, you might just have to do it anyway, mate. So it's not a choice for you.
Yep.
So, okay, I've got a good example, though, for you, actually, because I thought, this is one of the reasons I wanted to do this episode, because obviously most of the games you were listing off, like StarCraft, like League of Legends, the big problem there as well is people will see Koreans and they'll think, CLS, it's not about North America, it's just Koreans, isn't it? And then also, sadly, infrastructure was always the lamest excuse for why Koreans were the best. Because remember, everyone used to say, right, Koreans are the best because they have like televised StarCraft leagues and every player walks down the street and everyone knows him because he's a superstar and StarCraft's as big as baseball. Like, all those like lies that everyone showed. And then they always pull up that one picture from that one Pro League final in like 2006 and they're like, there were 2.5 million people. It's like, first of all, there wasn't. I can count the fucking rows. There's like 20 rows of like, 40. Like, I can do the maths. Like, that can't be 100,000 people. Shut the fuck up. Secondly, then you've got to add in, like, it was always overblown how big the game was. I always say to them, it was more like a fad, It was like Magic the Gathering or something, It had its time and it had its aspect. Or poker. You could take poker because obviously that died out in NA, had its fad time. But what I always say is, again, that's masking the culture. Because the reason why I'm saying this is, yes, Koreans are so exceptional that they probably are outliers in every context. But the reason we know this isn't just Korea being better than NA is because, obviously, in my background from Counter-Strike basically, as I said, was just Europe and North America. And even when I say Europe, that never really worked as well because we only really said Europe if you were like me from the UK or you're from Germany because you're trying to like hop on the fucking bandwagon for all the Scandinavians. Like, no, it's Europe. Oh, North America, you suck. Like, UK teams were about as good as North America. But we had Koreans in Counter-Strike. They were just called Swedes. And now this is what's very interesting. The reason why Swedes as a country overwhelmingly had most of the best teams in history. At one point in time, really were just, there was tournaments where you had international teams and it was like Sweden 1, 2, and 3, and then NA, Germany, 4, 5, 6, like it literally was like they were a step above. Is again, as far as I can tell, cultural. But here's what's funny. Everyone, even Swedes, because remember, this is one of the weird things about this LS is you can't ask a Korean what his culture's like. You can't ask a Swede what their culture's like. They don't know. That's like asking a fish what water's like. How would he know? It's just there, isn't it? So he's going to assume other things. So Swedes even used to say, well, the reason we're better is because, it's cold where we live, so we play a lot. And, we've got a lot of LAN cafes, so you can meet up with people. It's like, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, I come from the northeast of England. Have you seen me wearing those fucking scarves in my video? We didn't have any fucking superstar Counter-Strike player from the northeast of England, so that can't work, right? But my take on it was, when I got to know Swedes as people, and obviously I'm not from their culture, so I can see differences. One of the things is Counter-Strike as a game, it doesn't really have as many sort of set rules to it as like Macro does in League of Legends or like the metagame development in a Starcraft match. So it's not that you're learning things by rote as much, but the ultimate quality you can have in Counter-Strike is team play. Because you're doing a lot of things on the fly and you're doing things where like it's two players have to work together, and they could have vaguely practiced this scenario, but it'll be different every time because it's an FPS game and there's a lot of precision. You don't just press E, you actually have to aim it on him. There's a lot of aspects that make it like execution of team players hard as well. Well, the interesting detail is Swedes as people have kind of, it's not entirely like it, but in a world with no Koreans, they're the next best example, because what they are really good at is in their culture. First of all, this is one of the reasons why like they have been so open to like socialist political ideas. They have a mentality of like the group is more important than a person. And in fact, they even have a cultural, this thing that's like called the Law of Jante, which basically in that region of Scandinavia, it's these set of rules that apparently it's from a fictional book, but it's based on what like life was like in villages. And in these villages, they had these sort of unwritten rules that were like, never think you're better than everyone else, like never brag about things, like, always serve other people where you can. And the good thing about this mentality is when you got a bunch of skilled Counter-Strike players together, it meant naturally, they didn't have to be trained to do this by a coach. They would naturally play well together. Like someone would understand, I'm not the star player, so I've got to help this guy succeed. It wouldn't be like in some other teams where you'd have a bunch of skill. Like NA often would just stack all the aim stars together. And then you'd have this ridiculous scenario where, the third or fourth best player is kind of a waste there because he can't have all the resources, but at the same time, he's not going to be a great team player and he's not going to facilitate his other stars. Therefore, even his stars aren't going to look as good. And it all becomes like a weird scenario. So as a result, that's a good example because there's no Koreans involved, but you can see how what's great is there's two aspects to it. One, a cultural difference helps make it look like there's a drastic difference, even though I can tell you right now, there were North American players as skilled as Swedish players. Absolutely. And the other aspect that I think is really cool, because this is why it's not about like bagging on NA, is again, nobody taught those Swedish players that. They didn't all have a rule and an infrastructure of coaches like, you've got to all play for each other. Unfortunately, they just have a cultural advantage over NA players. So it's not that we're bagging on NA players because Koreans didn't choose this. In fact, some of this shit comes from like thousands of years ago in the Confucian times, or it has nothing to do with League of Legends or esports. So I'm not blaming them, but I'm saying there's not a quick fix like infrastructure, clearly. In fact, if anything, you've got to do a workaround, right? We've got to go a different route because like, when I said before, especially in League of Legends or Starcraft, you wouldn't want to be a pro player if you knew what it took for a Korean player. So if you're probably going to have to go a different route. You're going to have to train differently. Maybe you have to train more efficiently to not have to train in as many hours. Maybe you have to train in a very sort of, maybe you have to like not be results orientated if you're playing on Western ladders, because obviously you're not going to face someone who'll push you to be the best. You might have to train in a way where it's like I said about the Brazilian CS team, I'll always do the right thing, even if in this particular game, this NA team would let me win if I just did something kind of cheesy here. But I know when I then go and play the best European team, they won't do that. So I'm wasting my practice if I do that. I feel like that's one of the answers to it, right? And is we have to sort of find kind of like a scaffolding to make our own Western culture, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. I think solving the problem is like a group effort in a way. One of the things that I do like, or one of the things that I think that would be actually good is if you could even have this in other games. When historically some people have had the most success in StarCraft 1 or 2, or even League of Legends, right, is obviously team environment. But I think when you go deeper and you have a team environment, when you have multiple people of different teams or whatever come together, and create something, right? I like the Chinese. I don't know how it's actually going, but China had this special ladder that was initiated. You had to be Diamond 1 or higher on any server, and then you could get invited to it.
Oh, this is the one that Apto was on, right? Where it's kind of like the super server.
Yes, the super server. I feel like if NA could have a super server located next to LCS so that everyone has 8 ping or 9 ping or something, that would be great. If there could be a super server. And this is obviously specific for LoL. Yeah.
The problem there, though, LS, is I know, for example, when they moved the server away from LA in NA, that a lot of the NA players at first tried to do things like, let's just do in-house scrims and, like, let's have like... And what happened is, unfortunately, this is where people are going to get mad, but one of the factors that does hold the West back, literally, is people like Riot. Because remember, Riot's aim to this day, their main aim is make people want to play solo queue, make people want to buy skins. Their main aim isn't have LCS be the best region. And so unfortunately, as far as I know, it's people like Riot who stop those things and were like, no, pro players must be playing with the general populace so that people have something to aspire to. And they use that term, which, by the way, they have this term in Overwatch as well. It's the most ridiculous concept. Path to pro. The idea that, if you get really high on the ladder, you're going to get picked up by a team. Like, that's like the most ridiculous, like, 80s movie shit ever, where, like if I go and play right now in fucking, like, Rutger Park in New York in a basketball pickup, no one's picking me up for the Lakers tomorrow. Like, it's not happening, Like, I'd have to at least be in an amateur team, semi-pro team, it'd be the same path we all had. So, unfortunately, I do feel like Riot, to some degree, does hold players back in that sense. Because they could do what you're asking right now. Like, okay, give all the LCS teams their own little mini solo queue and let them train there in proper conditions, and they'll get better.
I mean, I don't know about you, but I think it's pretty fucking inspiring or aspiring to try to get to the pro-only server. I think that's more luxurious, or it's more of a chase than getting, because NA solo queue is abysmal right now. You can be 100 LP in queue.
Well, also, LS, do you remember what Riot's version of that was? Like, no, don't worry, LS. You can win a jacket if you get in a challenge. You remember that one? Like, you got the jacket at the end of the split. That's like the most clown version of that ever.
It's like actually a straight jacket. Your skill's never going to get better. Oh, man. But if they could have a super server located next to LCS or something, and if the players would actually make use of it, but then the question arises, would they even make use of it, right? Because you have people, they want to hide picks, or maybe they don't want to be shown up. Okay. Maybe they don't want to go on that server and be ranked 200 on that server because there's so many players playing and it's a competitive server. That could shatter some of the mentals, I'm sure, of some of the Western players.
Well, actually, I've got a good example for you here, because this is kind of what has happened in a different sense in Counter-Strike, actually, which is one of the bad things about Counter-Strike is we don't have a system like solo queue, because unfortunately, when you play in Counter-Strike, first of all, there are a lot more cheaters. So it means when you get high up, even if you're the best pro in the world, you're wasting your time in a bunch of games because the guy's just cheating. And also, they didn't design the server with pros in mind. So we don't like, if you get the best status in Counter-Strike, you have ranks, is global elite. But the problem is, like, I have a mate who's a commentator who's global elite. So it doesn't mean anything. He's not a pro player. So unfortunately, it's almost like they capped it out too early. They didn't put like enough like higher levels up. And part of it's because Counter-Strike's such a team-based game, Believe it or not, one of the reasons it works in League of Legends is because even though we're all joining a game where we might have never played together, there's still a formalized structure to a League of Legends game. Like, you're the jungler, I'm this, right? In Counter-Strike, that doesn't exist in the same way, In theory, we're all, like, remember, we're all the same character. So it's up to us to determine how we're playing and doing what, and so it gets a lot more messy. Now, here's the interesting thing, though. In CSGO, we overcame that problem by someone doing this. What happened is a company called FaceIt, who themselves run servers that are like proper games and you don't meet cheaters because they've got, anti-cheat on them. They actually made a pro version, and it's called FPL. It's called FaceIt Pro League. And what happens is it's pickup games, 5v5, like a real game, that only either pros, and this is the interesting part, only pros or people who are good enough to be at their level. And this is how they keep out people who would just fuck around, is if you go into that and you don't play properly and you refuse to communicate, or even, by the way, if you're a really good pro, but you don't play often enough, you only play like once a week or something, they have a like committee where they can just vote you out. And so as a result, they've created a culture where not only can pros get like good individual practice, but even better, This is the reason why if I was trying to sell a Riot on it, I'd tell them to do this. Even better, there have been a couple of players who came up from the Pro League, the Face It Pro League, this pickup system, who became pros because of that. Because what happened was they were playing with just only pros almost in every game. And we saw after like, a year, like, fucking hell, this guy's actually good. Like, if he gets into a team, someone's going to give him a chance. He eventually can become a good player. Whereas, if someone is just a good player on NA Challenger, you can never know even if he's good, because again, like, is the pro player trying? Are people dicking around? Is I'm a cutie pie just trolling or something? You can't tell.
Cutie pie is good. Cutie pie is good, but most, like what you're saying, most NA challengers, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. It doesn't mean anything at all. And that's a problem. And if they would make a system like what you're saying, I think that would be fantastic. Because one of the first things that comes to mind is, do you remember the old StarCraft 1 leagues? Like, the super small prize pool, like ASL or TSL, that drove competition. You never saw some of the foreigners get as high as they did on the IC Cup ladder as they did during those events, because they were cutthroat. They were going against one another. They were fighting for seeding and they were fighting for spots and stuff. And you had these players and they were tryharding and they were playing against players. They were being forced to play against Koreans at certain points because there was just no one else to play. And the foreigners that weren't really good, they would get B+ or they'd get A-, they'd clench their spot and they'd camp it, right? Well, those fuckers, they're out in the first round anyway, so that doesn't really matter. But the actual players, the players that were really good, it drove competition and it made them hungry. And that was some of the best times on IC Cup, was during ASL or during TSL. It was so active. It was so fun. Everyone was trying. The builds that everyone was using, for the most part, unless you're fucking October Zerg, was actually legitimate. And I think that would be fantastic, because in NA right now, like I said earlier, you have this problem where you have these people that can get away playing completely terrible champions at high MMR and they don't get punished for it. Or they don't take the game serious. They don't play meta. They play whatever the fuck they want. They don't think about team compositions. They don't think about, what champions am I going to work on? Why am I going to work on it? And it fosters this mentality that I can do what I want because you can't ban me for it. But if there was a league or a server where you couldn't do what you want, or you couldn't just decide that, fuck, you're going to, play Sona bot lane every single game, or you're going to play 300 games of Janna, then maybe it actually drives competition. For the people that are going to be like, oh, I need a safe space and I don't want to play in that environment, great, then you stay on the main server.
Yes.
Because no one wants you anyway. And then I do feel like there would be so many kids that are like 16, 17, 18, whatever, maybe master tier or low challengers right now that people don't even know who the fuck they are, that would be so driven to make a name for themselves on the special server that they would try that much harder. Sure. That's just what I think would end up happening. And I don't think there's not a reason to try to go that route. As far as like the cultural fixing, I don't think that's way beyond, I think, anything that is going to be able to be implemented. It doesn't mean that I don't think NA or EU can beat Korea. I think that's possible in the same sense that, 5% is a possibility. But
I think I have a good example, though, for you, actually, because this is, again, I have the advantage in this scenario in that, obviously, my time in esports, I've been around a long time, so that certainly helps. But another thing that really helped me is that I'm not part of any of these cultures. Like, so for example, in Counter-Strike, like I joked there, I can say I'm European because, technically it's the continent of Europe, but someone from the UK has fuck all to do with someone from Sweden, mate. So I could already see differences with Swedish people, differences with Americans. I know people think America and England are similar. Okay, to some degree they are. They have the shared heritage. But again, there's cultural differences. I would see the differences there. And obviously with Korea, especially because I got to live there for a while, I got to get kind of a crash course in how radically different it was. And even some of my... Even some of the things I thought I knew from StarCraft, I was wrong about with how they were implemented, Well, one of the things that always surprised me about American traditional sports, so like the NBA, the NFL, is that in these sports, you have fantastic team compositions and you have people who can run complicated tactics. And I always thought, how is this though? This is very weird because it doesn't match up with what I see in American culture. And what I found was this. is that, first of all, American sports are the most heavily coached of any sports I'm aware of in the world. Like in European football, for example, soccer, they, even to this day, when they've gotten some degree of like tactics, you know, and they do try to like map out stats, when they, like, first of all, they don't have timeouts in football. You can only talk to your team before the game, at halftime, and after. That's it. Whereas, you know, in American sports, you can call a timeout and you can give someone instructions right now. So as a result, already you can't like literally micro the game if you're the coach in soccer. And even if you listen to their team talk at halftime, it tends to be like very simple, like broad strategy. Like, oh, hey, the guy who's the winger, like you need to like play a little bit closer to your man, you know, so you can get further up the, you know, that's a very simple thing. He's not giving them like an X and O, like go to this spot here, or it's just man management. It's like motivation, or, you know, oh, you're a bit down, but like, you know, stick in there. So it's very simple stuff. And as a result, European soccer is much more about like, it's kind of like more art form, you know, you're just playing loose, but you're hoping you have a good mix of people, good chemistry, and we naturally play off each other with a bit of improvisation, right? In American sports, I couldn't believe it when I found out in the NBA that like, oh, when you go beyond like dunking and shooting the ball, people are running like complicated sets and the defensive guy has a special assignment or what to do. And I was like, how did they get these players to do this? And what I found out was, first of all, like I said, with the timeout concept, you get a lot more opportunities to coach people. You can actually call it, say, hey, timeout, like you're doing this wrong. Like you're supposed to pick this guy up further up the court or over this side. You can literally give people like essentially your knowledge as a coach to them in the game that they wouldn't have in the game. It's whereas in League of Legends, you know, one of the reasons why it's so hard to coach someone is you coach them and then you have to sit back and they have 40 minutes where they can make 50 wrong decisions and you can't go, hey, time out, like guys, watch out, you're gonna fuck this up. You can't do that. You have to just let them, they have to sort of learn the whole game from you and go play it. Well, here's the interesting detail is not only do they add all these aspects, which almost seem like Americans know they need a lot of like hands-on coaching, but even in terms of the structure of how you become a pro in those sports. So one of the reasons actually why the NBA got a little bit worse in terms of like raw basketball fundamentals in the 2000s is they started to make it so that people could come straight from high school to the NBA if they were good enough. So you could be 18 and go there. Whereas before, if you were playing in like the era of Michael Jordan, like the 1980s to the 90s, you had to go to college because that's where they drafted the top players from. They would pick the guy who was like the best college player. He's going to be number one pick. So what happened back then was if you were a basketball player, okay, right, you grow up, like obviously you start becoming good in high school. So at high school, you already have a coach there. Now, he might not be great if you come from a small high school, but the point is you get coached there. He gives you some basic concepts of like, this is how you're going to play as a team. Then you go to college. Now, first of all, it's prestigious to be playing for the best college. So you're going to want to play for that guy who's the head coach of the best college. And therefore, at the college level, you already are getting trained in like, this is how you play your role. This is how you play as a team. Don't be egotistical. So before you even get to the pro level, you've had all this fantastic coaching. And it's not an exaggeration. If you look in the NBA and the NFL, almost every great player who also won the championship at some point in his career was touched by like a legendary coach. I don't mean like Sandusky style, obviously there. I mean, I can't help myself unless I had to put on it. But I mean, like, you know, they had a coach either at college level or at the pro level who was able to take not just their talent, but like channel it, you know, direct it. And I have to say, this is an area in Western esports in general that everyone is still way behind, and especially NA. Like to this day, one of the reasons why guys like Path get mad tilted when people say that they like fucked up like TSM at Worlds is they're like, dude, you know how little control I have over this team. Like I do the picks and bans. Yeah. Like I try to tell him to do the rest, but if Doublelift wants to go and fucking do whatever he wants, he does that, doesn't he? They're not kicking him out the team. So yeah, I think this is actually, it wouldn't fix the culture, but it's sort of like, that's why I said it's like scaffolding. It's like an artificial fix to it in a way. You know, you sort of try and error correct in a few areas and hope that they go more towards what you want.
Right. I agree. I think that's, I think just basically set it up and hope that they eventually get it correct. And I think you do that over and over with just enabling the environment.
I mean, you did get to coach in the NALCS. What would you say to this? Because I have to say, okay, since just to be fair, since I blamed Riot for them not letting us have the super server in that aspect, I actually blame teams for this part because if someone like Reginald, who obviously, actually, I have to give him credit. If you want to talk about culture, well, there's a reason why TSM was in every LCS final till now. He created kind of an asshole culture, but guess what? It kept people in line. It kept people focused on the task. And so you can see on a mini level how his culture helped his team rise above sometimes more talented teams elsewhere, you know. But one of the things I will say is, so few Western teams to this day in LCS have ever given proper control to a coach. Like, they've definitely never give him like ability to fire a player. Oftentimes you can't actually bench a star player. Like, even if you did it, he'll just go to the owner and say,
you can't.
Yeah, and again, unfortunately, they're putting business ahead of competition there. They don't want to bench the superstar player that everyone wants to see, because that's what I'm selling everything off. Right? That's what all my fans want to see. So that's going to hold you back if you make those choices, right?
Yeah, you have the branding problems where you can't threaten to bench the star player. You have the drama that can ensue on Reddit and Twitter, and the sponsors get angry or the higher ups get angry. But also, these players aren't expendable. In Korea, you could kick potentially star player and find a replacement for him in a month or two, somewhere on the ladder, or someone else from another team that would come up and yada yada yada. But in NA, the player base just doesn't exist. Also, this is interesting. There's a comparison to Starcraft with League of Legends. League of Legends mid laners are like Starcraft Terrans. NA, it just doesn't have them. They just don't exist. North American mid laners.
Well, my joke has always been, LS, the reason why Pobelter is the best NA mid, and always has been pretty much, is because he's just really good as an average player, and he's just a perfect average pro. But he's never going to be Bjergsen, is he? Like, I know people do that. Whenever he makes like a final, like when he was in Team Liquid now, CLG, when Immortals was really good in the regular split, people are like, Pobelter's so good. I'm like, are we watching the same game? Like, he's decent, yeah. But he's not Bjergsen, fucking Perks, there's a reason why these guys are a level above. And also, yes, as we've pointed out many times, Bjergsen's not from NA.
Yeah, Bjergsen's not from NA.
I mean, sooner or later he's going to be eligible for that green card, but he's not from NA.
Right. So
it's a good comparison. Okay, unpack it then. Why are they like Terrans in Korea?
I think that mid lane, so a little bit off topic, but mid lane is fundamentally the hardest role, I think, in League of Legends by far.
In terms of the mechanics and the matchups and stuff.
Everything. Like, you don't say that Zerg doesn't have as much mechanical intensiveness as Terran. Of course it does. Mutalist micro, defiler control, controlling 200 units, attacking with minimap and stuff. Terran has their own problems, right? Using vessels and stuff, and marine medic, siege tanks, and whatever. But Terran had to be so good at so many things and so well-rounded and understand it all in order to make it come together. Whereas Zerg and Protoss, you could just hit proper timings and stuff. Yes, you do need mechanics, you do need micro and stuff. But if the timing was on point, in some cases it just didn't matter. If you weren't as good, if you weren't as well-rounded. Terran needed to be crisp on everything in order to make it work. Similarly, mid lane is basically the same thing. And I think that it's because of that, the core fundamentals of mid lane and what is required to be a good mid laner, that North Americans just don't have it. The mindset just isn't there. The attention to detail in terms of what is actually important. Here's the sickest thing, LS.
I'll just make one statement that will just highlight how ridiculously NA doesn't have it. Remember, NALCS has always had more money. There has always been more money to be made becoming a pro because of streaming. Every single advantage should go to NA for mid laners, right? Now, everyone's going to think, I know where Thorin's going here. European mid laners. No, I don't need that. All I need is this, LS. Just Danish mid laners. Just Denmark alone. We got your fucking Bjergsen, Jensen, Frogger. Oh, we've already got 3 world-class mids, and you've got Pobelter. Get the fuck out. That's all we've produced in NA for 10 years. Like, Denmark alone's producing more.
Even North America's other premier mid laner, at his prime high, he wasn't known for mechanics or fundamentals.
Yes.
He was known for the creativity. So that's like fucking G5 in Protoss vs. Terran. He was known for his bulldogs or, Dark Templar or carriers or something, like, not for actually outmuscling his Terran opposition. There's no one else. What North American, and I don't think that there's going to be either. Primarily just because of how Americans tend to view things, right? A quick means to an end. Looking to just get the finish without having it be refined or having it be crisp.
And here's the thing, right? I mean, obviously I'm not an expert in League of Legends, so I'll open this up for you to expand on, but isn't the reason why this is a good analogy, the fact that it's the mid lane, is because, okay, part of the problem is people are already going to say, but yeah, LS, we've got obviously like double lift and we've got AD carries, and we've got junglers, like this is smart players like Smithy, Meteors, we've got some top laners have been able to play well, but I would say this, every other role in League of Legends except mid lane is fairly defined. So, for example, Meteos doesn't have godlike mechanics, but as long as he makes great decisions and he knows how to control vision, he can play the role. AD carry, sometimes you can be just mechanics, as we saw at certain times in Doublelift's career. Sometimes he had really wonky understanding of the game, but guess what? You could CS like a motherfucker and last hit you in a team fight. Whereas the analogy I would give is this, especially, I mean, admittedly, mid lane, like direct ability to carry has been somewhat reduced over the last year or so, but especially for most of history. The reason why I made that video a few years back where I was complaining that like mid lane, the game's biased towards mid lane, is because like you're saying, like the control you have over the map, the amount of things you can do, the power of the champions, like mid lane's basically like the equivalent of like the queen in chess or something, It can just do everything. Everything else does, like, bishop just moves like diagonally, the knight moves like that. Like, this can do everything. That's why it's the fucking, the point here is, in fact, actually this ties in perfectly to League of Legends, right? I guess NA has sort of had a shortcut to having good teams because they just do get Bjergsen and fucking Jensen, But if NA already had some super good mid laners, they'd show that they were on the way to solving the problem.
Yeah. They would.
That would kind of be a great like marker to show if they have improved the scene and the culture, if they ever produced a bunch of good mid laners.
If good mid laners start appearing, I think that that's a sign that NA's players, or the player base, Diamond 1 and higher or something, is starting to change the mindset and the mentality. But the reality of the situation is that most of the mid laners that are on academy teams or something, or they're up and coming, they've been around for 4 or 5 years.
Yes.
Nothing's going to change. None of the new name mid laners are going to improve upon anything because they are so driven by their own ego, or they're so driven by results, that they're completely oblivious to how bad they actually are in comparison to people that are really, really, really good fundamentally. And they would let themselves be blinded by Bo 1 or, Bo 3 wins over elite level players. Like if a random academy mid laner beat Bjergsen in lane twice or something, he would think, oh man, I'm on par with Bjergsen.
Yeah.
The same way that a Western team can beat a Korean team at MSI or Worlds once, and everyone will erupt and say, oh, the gap is closing. No, it's not. So I don't know. But I really do like the point that you're bringing up, that I think that when we see mid laners changing, I think that that'll be a telltale sign that NA as a region, or its solo queue, is changing. But I don't think that we're going to see it. I really don't think that we'll see mid laners appear similarly to how Terrans just didn't exist in StarCraft 1.
Because actually, that's the thing that's really worrying, is like, obviously Europe in this sense, that probably explains why Europe had so many great international results, is their strongest position's always been mid lane. They've produced all these ridiculous mid laners, and obviously then they come from a culture where they all play each other on Challenger. To be the best, you're already competing against Froggen or someone in Europe before you get to the pro level. Well, the weird thing is, like, actually, famously, China never used to have that many super sick mid laners. Even they've got lords now. They've got like fucking Zhao Hu. They've got a whole bunch of people who are monsters. These guys are right up there with the Koreans.
Yep. China's doing really well as well. China's been a region that's actually been, I feel like China has improved so much since their StarCraft 1 days. Because China, way back in StarCraft 1, they were like super NA. They were NA if NA had mechanics. with the same level of ridiculous cheese and gimmicks and everything, and it was just really, really obnoxious. But obviously they had LX and PJ, the Protoss players that were really, really, really good, and they were macro beasts. But usually, you know, most of the Zergs and the Terrans, they were all really cheesy, completely based around timing attacks, coupled with really, really strong mechanics. Yeah, so the Chinese players, I feel like the region has been evolving over time. And I feel like it actually has been getting better. Even when I watch Chinese League of Legends this year, I feel like there is a noticeable improvement in how they seem to be approaching the game. And so in that regard, I think that's actually really, really refreshing, because that's something that I didn't expect would occur so soon. You know, it's only been a year since I still held the perception and view that China was very reckless and overly aggressive to a fault, and they were still just super West. That was how I perceived China. But NA, I don't know. I don't know what they'll end up doing. I don't know how they'll try to salvage the situation. And also, the other main predicament is with franchising and stuff and branding and all this other stuff becoming more important probably to a lot of people. You have to wonder really where are the priorities going to be.
Oh, that definitely has like a dark element to it, which is that unfortunately, like this is actually one of the things that people don't realize is there was actually to some degree before franchising something of like a cap on how much sponsorship money you could raise, how much revenue you could make as a team, because there was no way, like you could only compete in LCS. You couldn't go and compete in some extra tournaments, you know, that you weren't available. And also, you know, all you get is the hours that you're on the LCS. There's no way to make more money. Well, now that you can make more revenue, it actually incentivizes a team even more to stick with like a decent veteran than to try the young guy who's never been done shit, you know. I mean, I know some people won't, because guess what? Even within that system, some guys do just want to win. Someone might be like Reginald and just only care about winning the league. But there's definitely going to be people who are brilliant businessmen who are going to be like, you know what? Even if this player here, who's like the 5th best AD carry, even if he's fallen off a bit, you know what? He's somewhat popular. People like his personality. He's got good image. I could make a lot of money off him that I won't make off this brand new guy that no one knows yet.
Yeah. And something in that regard that's scary for me is what happens when the truly elite level players start getting faded. In the sense where they maybe don't have the same energy or ambition to keep trying to improve at that point, and they want to just coast by on the branding. Then they end up locking down a position, and that's just really, really, I think, cancerous, basically, for the entire environment. Like, let's say one day Bjergsen just decides, like, he's had enough with trying to improve. I don't think this is going to be the case. But let's say that one day he just decides he's had enough with trying to improve, and he's content with where he is in North America, and he just wants to keep gliding by at the state that he's in. Well, that's a spot that's just probably locked down, and you can't really make use of it, and then no one's going to get access to it. And then what ends up happening? Well, the practice ends up suffering, training, scrims against them ends up suffering, everything just ends up getting worse. That's, I think, a pretty real fear. Unless enough players keep coming up that the old dogs do get cycled out. And if, you know, the players that are truly elite, like Jensen, like Bjergsen, can actually retain their competitive drive for years to come. Because as soon as they get complacent, I think that's a really, really big problem for all the main rosters and even academy teams.
I'm Kelsey Moser, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel, where no sandbagging goes unscrutinized.
This video was made possible by Dean Tanglis, Sanity, Gman, Andreas, Snazore, Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Jerky's Minion, Anthony, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Travis T. Greb. Just like my man, a lot of people think you can't tell me nothing. But I've graduated from that mindset, And now it is possible to have influence over some of the people I have on my shows, some of the topics I cover, to ask me questions directly and get exclusive teasers for upcoming projects I'm working on. Unlock the code to the streets and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link below.